Welcome, Katherine Neebe, who's Chief Sustainability Officer for Duke Energy. Welcome. And also Kentaro Hosomi, who's EMEA Chief Regional Officer for the MHI Group. Welcome to you both. Now, I hope we're joined virtually by two faces I recognize very well. Sharan Burrow. Welcome, Sharan. Nice to see you. Who is General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, and also Mafalda Duarte, who's Chief Executive of Climate Investment Funds. Welcome to you both. We are looking at how do we ensure a just and equitable transition for all. And can I encourage those in the room and those anywhere around the world, from the thousands who are watching online, please do send questions to which I can use to beef up the way we're going to look at these issues. Sharan, if I can come to you first, because I was very struck. I would like you to frame this, because I was very struck when you said at President Biden's virtual summit in April, words to the effect of there's no point having a planet and jobs on a planet which is actually under existential threat. We've got to have new jobs for a new planet, and we've got to essentially reconfigure everything we're thinking about the way forward. Where do you think we are now, 6 months on, from when you said words which are equivalent to that?
So thanks, Nick. It's very low in sound, so I hope you can hear me. But it's very simple. We're in a race against time for both people and the planet. We have a convergence of crisis. We had historic levels of inequality. It was generating despair and anger before COVID-19. And of course, we had the climate crisis. Now we've got a community crisis driven by economic lockdowns from a global health pandemic. We have to deal with these things in an integrated way. So we will only indeed make the race for the planet if in the next 9 years, as we fight to stabilise the planet, we ensure a just transition. And that means jobs, jobs and jobs. It means national jobs plans. It means company jobs plans. And of course, it means community renewal. If we leave workers or communities stranded, then fear becomes the resistor. People have to be involved. Unions need a seat at the table to design a future. And indeed, business needs that confidence as well. So a just transition is simply about involving people and the planet as equal partners in the race to a sustainable environment for everybody.
Sharan, but that was 6 months ago. What would you say has happened in the last 6 months? Do you think there's reassurance
for employees? Well, the timeline's just got shorter, Nick.
But do you think people are reassured by what they're hearing, that green means change, means good, means new opportunity, or not?
There is some shifts. There's no doubt about that. There's a community of business that understand that, frankly, business as usual is not acceptable. But it's also, I have to say, on the streets here, it's demonstrated there's a chasm between those that are trying very hard to ramp up ambition in the centre, and of course people feeling like they're still excluded, that they don't have a secure future. So if anything, the urgency is even greater today than it was 6 months ago. We need to create those jobs. It's possible. Can I tell you, for every 20 jobs in renewables, there's 5 to 10 in supply chains, manufacturing in particular, and there's 30 to 35 if they're good jobs with just wages in the broader economy. That's how you build communities. But unless companies, governments and unions, and also of course where it's about community renewal, communities are at the table, then you can't rebuild that trust. Trust is broken, and we need to put it at the heart of the joint ambitions for jobs and indeed for climate.
Thank you. Well, look, that's an important framing. We are talking about an equitable transition for all. Mafalda Duarte, Chief Executive of the Climate Investment Funds. Mafalda, what's your view, particularly when you look back at the work you've been doing at the World Bank in recent years? Is there a significant shift underway?
Hi, Nick, and pleasure to being with you all. I do think that what we are seeing more and more is placing just transition, social inclusion, social equity at the heart of most of the conversations when it comes to climate change. I mean, we see it more and more and I say it often as well, and it resonates with a lot of audiences that climate solving the climate crisis and solving social inclusion and social equity are two sides of the same coin. Um, but we do have a long way to go. I think we see it in discussions and in debates, but we are faced with quite a few challenges. One challenge is that there's actually lack of practical information on how transitions work or apply in developing countries. We have been looking at what exists out there, and three-quarters of what is documented out there, it focuses on developed countries, on the US, Australia, or these are global, this is global information. There's also, limited understanding. We are talking about quite deep transitions that are required. There's a limited understanding of, how these transitions in different sectors will actually play out. Um, we also have, of course, the challenges of in developing countries in particular, and those are the countries that we focus on, high levels of unemployment. And normally, because of those high levels of unemployment, the policies and the measures tend to be more focused on short-term job creation rather than transformation of the unsustainable jobs to sustainable and decent jobs. In developing countries, we have a very large informal sector, and it's around 2 billion people working informally. And it's more challenging to tackle that group of the population. We also have capacity and coordination challenges. The responsibility for the climate change policies and strategies are really spread across government departments and stakeholder groups. And what that does, makes it harder to coordinate and address these multi-sectoral and geographic aspects of the transition. And also, then, there's the issue of the necessary stakeholder engagement to come up with just transition strategies. And this requires, it requires resources and it requires time.
All right. Well, Mafalda, can
And
we?
of course, the financing gap. So there's quite a number of challenges that need to be tackled. But I am positive in the sense that, as Sharon said, I think I see more and more, not just at the global level, but at in certain countries as well, an understanding that these are two and if we want to tackle climate change and tackle this crisis, we really need to tackle the social inclusion dimension as well.
Must tackle social inclusion. Well, let's move on to get a perspective from industry. Two important words there, or phrases, from Sharan: a chasm, and also from Mafalda: a limited understanding. What's your view from Duke Energy, Katherine?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. This is a really important discussion. So I'll be very brief. If you aren't familiar with Duke Energy, Duke is one of the largest, if not the largest, it depends how you measure it, utilities in the United States of America. We've got a market cap of about $77 billion and revenues of around $22 billion. We are in the midst of a clean energy transformation with aspirations to net zero by 2050 for carbon and net zero in methane emissions for our natural gas business by 2030. So this is a significant shift that is underway. As we are thinking about the next decade of our business, we're investing around $100 billion in our communities in that clean energy transformation. And having worked in sustainability for 20 years, having been now this is my third COP, I'm really excited that we're putting the S of ESG in really the heart of the conversation. I feel like it has been missing for a very, very long time. So we're leaning into the issues of the just transition. As I think about it, it's really about the coal retirement underway. We're leading the largest retirement of coal in our sector in the US. And then I also think about issues like environmental justice. And as we invest this $100 billion plus dollars in our community, how are we really working with our communities, with thought leaders, with subject matter experts to ensure that the transition is equitable?
How much of a battle is it internally? Or is there a very strong, unanimous movement within Duke Energy on this important principle? I remember Jim Rogers, your former chief executive, saying these kind of things 10, 15 years ago, but it was an uphill battle.
Yeah, well, I think times have changed. I joined Duke about a year ago, and I mean times have changed in a good way at Duke. So we have been, under Jim's leadership, and now Lynn Good, our current CEO, she's amazing, we have been working on climate change for well over a decade. We're already at 40% of emissions reductions relative to 2005, and we've retired over 50 coal units. So this is not really a new conversation for the company. The shift forward to embrace issues like environmental justice and the just transition, I think there's a matter of...
And sustainability.
And sustainability, yes. The language is new, the issues are not, if that distinction makes sense. And I think one of the things that I've really been heartened by about Duke's approach has been really taking a pause, taking a beat this past year and saying, we need to sit down with stakeholders, with subject matter experts, with thought leaders, and understand what they think good looks like, and then evolve our business forward to really meaningfully lean in the way people expect and want us to. So it's less of, I think, and I say this with love coming from corporate America, it's less of a, we've arrived at the solution, here you go world, please love us, and it's a much more humble, methodical way of really understanding and unpacking the issues.
But do you feel you're pushing a boulder up a hill? You've been in the company a year.
I don't think I'm pushing a boulder up the hill at Duke. I think Duke has got it. They've seen it. The issue is these things are just also really hard to do. You have to be very, very thoughtful. So I wouldn't say there's a boulder so much as no one company can tackle these issues alone, so we really do need partners to help facilitate and support and tell us what we've got right and what we've got wrong.
Kentaro, your view from Mitsubishi about this incredibly critical issue of equitable transition for all.
Yeah, as for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, MHI, looking at the world, 1/3 of all the carbon emissions today comes from the industrial sector. And we're focusing on those kind of industries to decarbonize, to reduce the carbon footprint for those companies. So this is where, the just and equitable transition is very important, I believe. And one of the examples is that, for example, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, it has prime metals technology, which has a direct reduction technology for using hydrogen as a reduction in the steel making industries. This technology we have could be applied if the steel manufacturers will use such kind of technology to produce carbon-free steel.
And it's moving in that direction fast.
Yes, it's exactly. But here what we need is a partnership with such kind of steel mills, which are willing to change their sums to carbon-free steel manufacturing. And also for that steel mill to act on that, they need customers who are willing to adopt these sort of carbon-free steels for their products, such as car manufacturers and those kind of things. And this is also a partnership which is required. And in order to produce such kind of carbon-free steel, we need the hydrogen to provide for the fuel as the direct reduction material for that. So this also requires a partnership. So this kind of, I would say, a global partnership between the industries is one of the key to an equitable and just transition in the global scale.
easy to use the phrase equitable transition. So let me pick up, particularly from what Sharan said right at the beginning, and the questions we're trying to look at here about how to ensure the substantial benefits of a green economy transition are shared widely. How do we support those who stand to lose economically? Countries, regions, industries, sectors, communities, workers, or consumers? Because we've got one question here, Sharan, from Sarah Vague. How can we ensure jobs are provided when transitioning away from coal and other energy in developing countries or countries dependent on coal and coal-based economies? What is your experience literally in the last few months? We've heard from Poland, the host of COP23 a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, that they accept that coal, even down in Silesia, will no longer be the heart of the economy down there. What are you seeing? What trends are you seeing in terms of acceptance of the inevitability of massive structural shift and therefore implications for society?
You talking to me, Nick?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Oh, sorry. It's a very faint.
You're adjusting your
Well,
television,
Felicia's a really
your
good
monitor.
case study. When we went to the COP in Warsaw, you will remember the tension. In fact, we had a community with 5,000 coal miners on the one hand, 500 climate activists on the other, all part of our broad church. But when we went to Katowice, what we actually saw was the president of the COP, despite all the difficulties, put in place a declaration that he had talked to us about, accepted that just transition was absolutely part of the equation, and got 40 odd heads of state to sign up. Now, that was the start of a commitment in areas like Silesia to transform their economy. There is still fear because the jobs are slow to come, but they're turning around their industries. They're looking at new industries. What do you do about energy that's not based on coal? How do you actually promote future based on clean energy that can then spin off or underpin, if you like, the transition in all industries, in construction, in auto, in agriculture, in transport? So I think Silesia is going to be one of, indeed, the success stories. It still needs time. It certainly needs money. And if you look at a parallel piece, Nick, then this week in South Africa, you saw the world, or at least 5 major countries in the world, come to support South Africa's transition. Huge public utility, Eskom. Now they've put in place a community study with the voices of workers and the communities. They're negotiating with a collective bargaining council around jobs, and South Africa has a national jobs plan, but now around jobs in the company. They're looking at distributed energy, they're looking at renewables. They're actually integrating the supply chain so they can see where the manufacturing possibilities for renewable energy are in terms of community renewal. That's the kind of evidence based dialogue we need in every community.
Let me again for the basis, for the benefit of understanding what evidence you're seeing. I hope you can hear me, Sharan. Given the Green Deal in the European Union affecting vast numbers of people and the fears, particularly in some parts of Eastern Europe, that this was going to decimate traditional industries, again, what are you seeing when it comes to the commitment to a vast expenditure from the European Union, which will be social support, and whether that is beginning to be accepted and therefore it's affected the more pessimistic views of where things are going? In other words, is there good ground for optimism a few months after the Green Deal was announced?
So the European Union is a standout. There's no doubt about that. And they have put the money in place. They have just transition as one of the 3 pillars of the Green Deal. They also have, a pillar of social rights, but they have a commitment to net zero as well across the bloc. But it's also true that people are still waiting in many of the more difficult communities. If you look at a country like Bulgaria, we had an oil and gas discussion just a month ago. In fact, right here, for 2 nights, Friday and Saturday night, when it would have been nice to be enjoying Glasgow, but in fact, the unions had in-house discussions about the transition from oil and gas. Coal, we know, is painful, and it's still in transition, if you like. There's still a lot of work to be done to create those alternate futures. But oil and gas, one of the things we're very frustrated about is that the major oil and gas companies are not moving fast enough. They have the technology, they have the assets, they certainly have the capex to invest faster in renewables. They can transition the jobs that exist and, of course, pick up some of those coal communities in the process of transferring to renewables. That's a start. But also, of course, Nick, we've talked about, and this is what needs to happen right across the EU as well as here. Indeed, you've seen the Biden administration now equate climate action with jobs. That's good news, but we need to see those plans for every industry. I've also been really heartened here because the International Transport Federation, not only do we have a partnership around mass transit with the C40 group of mayors, but they're now talking about global framework agreements with the shipping companies, with the IMO, with the Global Compact about how we move faster to, clean energy for shipping and transport, which, of course, as you know, actually transports our ships transport about 80% of global trade. So every industry has to be in this conversation. Europe is trying to do that. The funds are there by and large, but we need to make sure that communities, and of course that means for us trade unions, are at the table and engaged, and that we diminish the fear with transparency around really concrete plans.
Well, I'd like to hear from all the other panelists as well. Mafalda, I hope you were able to hear. We lost you for a moment, but what Sharan was saying, that, and I'm trying to summarize here, that there are optimistic signals of how, if you can, with the Green Deal in Europe, at least there can be a transition. Therefore, there aren't big social costs because there is support. What's your view? What kind of data are you getting?
No, I certainly agree, and just to have people understand how complex these things can be. I mean, we ourselves looked at Mpumalanga in South Africa, and we've been part of this effort to that Sharon was alluding to come up with a political declaration between four sovereign countries in the European Union in support of South Africa. Well, we did some analysis on South Africa in Mpumalanga and also in one of the states in India, and just so that people understand how complex these things are. I mean, we have the issue of jobs. 30% of the jobs in coal regions, we are talking about coal here, can be impacted by the coal transition. So these are direct and indirect jobs. These are, in the case of India, this is more than 1 million people affected by a potential transition away from coal. But it's not just the jobs, it's the pensioners. There are pensioners relying on the current workers and future workers in these industries. There are the revenues to the national and the local government that comes from these industries. There are the investments that these companies make in the local economies. And also then, in the case of India, there are impacts across sectors with the Indian Railways that actually subsidizes quite a bit of the fares to, the general Indian population, potentially being affected by the loss of revenue from coal transportation. So this is why these agendas are complex because they touch on many dimensions. But as Sharon was saying, I think we are seeing positive, and again, the examples that she was giving on what's happening in South Africa, I agree that this is what we need to support and see in many other developing countries. Um, so I'm optimistic. We will be supporting ourselves, South Africa. We've launched in this COP an accelerating coal transition investment program, and we've very deliberately placed people and communities at the heart of that program. And we have been saying very clearly we will be supporting efforts to do job creation, to put in place social protection measures, to put in place skills development and retraining programs. So it needs to be part of the broader effort of transitioning the infrastructure and the assets as well. and we are also placing, a critical emphasis there on the dimensions, of procedural justice. How do we empower the different stakeholders to come to the table and be part of the decisions on what should be and how it should be done?
Well, let's pick up with Kathleen and Duke, and also from Mitsubishi as well. Kathleen, when you look at the problems President Biden has had in the last few weeks with West Virginia, and the real political kicking that was going on, how much do you think that that's actually a bump, a blip, or is it still symptomatic of a significant backlash, which is based on fear of what happens and that there won't be a just transition here?
I'm going to defer to policy experts who are going to read the nuance of all of that. I wouldn't begin to guess what Biden and Manchin are kind of thinking about and how they're navigating it. What I can talk about is how Duke Energy is thinking about this, which is the laser-eyed focus moving forward on the clean energy transition. There is no doubt that that is underway, and we are moving forward at pace to achieve our ambitions. I think, having worked in sustainability a long time, this is why I'm so heartened that the S of ESG is in this conversation right now, because my big fear is that we will try and maximize an environmental outcome without and jeopardize some of the social outcomes that we need desperately to achieve, and that will actually stall forward progress. I think that is a fair question or critique for multiple issues within the sustainability sector. What Duke Energy is doing, I'll take a couple of different angles here. On the just transition side, setting aside our overall workforce ambitions and how we're thinking about the clean energy transformation and ensuring our workers have the skills of today and the skills needed tomorrow, and also thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion to make sure that our workforce mirrors the communities where we operate. On the just transition side of the table, we just launched in North Carolina. This is the state where we have the largest operations, the largest revenue. In North Carolina, we just launched a training program where we're providing our workers that are in coal facilities with they're being trained with qualifications, and then over an 18-month intensive training process, they achieve and acquire 2 additional qualifications. As they achieve these additional skills, their pay and compensation moves up so that we're incentivizing their participation in these programs so that they're able to find those jobs outside of the coal sector when we do ultimately retire some of those facilities. On the environmental justice side of the table, I'll speak from the standpoint of, I'm also the president of the foundation, and so here we're really investing in the workforce, the environmental justice workforce, that on the environmental justice topic, what we hear is workforce and jobs, jobs, jobs. And so one of the things that we're investing in is supporting community college to get line worker programs up and running. This is an opportunity in the U.S. where we're seeing a current deficit in terms of trained and qualified workers, so really investing in those kind of programs. And we also just launched a program with 4 historically Black colleges and universities across the Carolinas, where we're really developing an energy education curriculum that runs across all different kind of components of the schools, so that students are graduating and are able to transition into energy or energy adjacent careers and sectors. And I'm super excited about it, because I feel like, well, there's all of this talk and all of this fear, and these are justified concerns, justified questions. I like to roll up my sleeves and say, well, let's just start knocking some of these things out and see what we learn, see what we can do, see what we run into that's a roadblock or an opportunity.
And is that the spirit in which this is being approached, do you believe, by a lot of people now or not?
I don't know about a lot of people, but I know at Duke Energy it's certainly the spirit.
But is it producing progress?
Yeah.
Does it produce positives?
Yeah, to me, this is a story. There are 2 narratives that sit in front of us. There's one narrative, which is one of where we don't get this right, and that's going to just really be detrimental to people, to communities. And there's another narrative where, if we're really thoughtful, as we think about, from the standpoint of Duke, the $120 billion that we're investing, if we're really thoughtful and thinking about not just environmental justice and the just transition, if we're also thinking about climate resiliency, if we're also thinking about economic development, I mean, the energy transition, the clean energy transformation has the potential to be a really exciting story. And I just think we're at a really interesting pivot point right now where we could go one or the other way, and I want us to go the positive way.
So Kentaro, let me pick up. There are several questions here about cement, iron, coal. But they're all about the same problem, which is about how those industries, which are still needed, are modernized, particularly iron and steel. And now a Swedish company has produced the first carbon-free steel. And it's a bit more expensive, but they're optimistic, what I read, about the impact that this is going to have. In other words, steel is not dead. Steel manufacturing is not dead. It's going to be produced in a different way. What's the view at Mitsubishi?
Yes, certainly. The transition means that it's not going to jump to a sort of a technology from one phase to a totally different dimension. And that's where the meaning of transition is. And also, we cannot overlook the fact that big companies like Duke Energy or Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, we are supported by a very wide range of supply chain. And this is the same with all that kind of industries. And those supply chain consists virtually of very small and medium-sized enterprises. And the important thing is that how we can include this kind of small and medium enterprises into this transition. This is going to be the key where we can transfer such kind of the steel manufacturing to a more carbon-free way or not. How we can include such kind of small and medium industries which are consisting the supply chain of us today. Making them inclusive is going to be the key to justify such kind of energy transition, I believe.
How much does a transition in the technology make the societal transition easier? Because ultimately, you're still going to be producing steel, but a different kind of steel, probably in the same location.
Yeah. One thing is that, as you have correctly mentioned, the hydrogen is used as the reduction in place of fossil fuel like gas or in the coal and these kind of things. But such kind of, we believe that the transformation of the industry in terms of the fuel to carbon-free fuel, this is one way of making that kind of transition a more practical one. And this means that we can use the existing infrastructures and existing facilities to the maximum. And on that way, we can transfer our assets to a cleaner world in this just transition. Yeah.
Well, I've been wrestling with how to put these questions, because they're very long questions, and therefore I'm trying to summarize them from Felix Scrivens and also Amanada. But I hope I can just morph them together. While it's important to ensure an equitable transition, is there not a moral imperative to address the unequal gains from industrial emissions between the developed and developing nations that has already occurred? And the one from Amanada is talking about is it possible to have one unified front dealing with heavy industry in general and cement specifically, particularly in the areas where the transition out of these industries is going to have significant societal impact? Can I ask you each to be quite brief, because we've only got 5.5 minutes. Sharan, just picking up on that if you can. I hope you were able to hear me, but particularly a unified front to address the issues of heavy industry, however you want to define it, and the societal implications.
It's absolutely critical, Nick. We must have everybody on board because all sectors have to transition. In fact, steel in Europe is a good news story, and with the right support, the sharing of IP, the technical know-how, but also the production capacity, we can export this around the world if solidarity around just transition is genuine. Because my own deputy president is an advisor to SSAB Steel, and we've been working with these companies now for a number of years. But having just produced the first 200 tons of carbon-free steel, this is an industry that ultimately can soak up jobs. We need certainly to retrain those who will be redeployed from the coking functions and the blast furnace operations. But overall, the new technologies will require more jobs. Ironically, the lead company in cement is in India. And it's now experimenting with a circular approach where they capture the carbon and the heat and reuse it in experimental areas like organic fertilizers, carbon rods, which are as strong as steel. So there is a much different approach to the future if we get heavy industry right. I was on the New Climate Economy Commission, and we couldn't determine at that point, indeed, how you could transfer industry. People like me argued it was absolutely essential. But since then, we've seen the Mission Possible report. We're seeing companies, governments, unions work together because the industries of today will largely be the industries of tomorrow. We may see some new ones, but we're still going to have construction and transport and
All right.
agriculture and energy and, of course, as the foundation. But what I would say, and I want to pick up on how
If you
you
could, Sharon, if
actually
you could just
move
do this very
developing
quickly because we're running out
economies,
of time.
because, you know, sorry, I was just going to say that
We're
in
running out of
developing
time, so
economies,
could you just make the point very quickly?
we need a new social contract everywhere. Of course, it's jobs, jobs, and jobs, climate friendly jobs with just transition, but we also need social protection, universal social protection. If the pandemic has taught us anything, if we can put a floor of resilience under people, if we can invest in our care economy, because that's a floor of resilience, then you have to see these areas as integrated into the technological transformation we
All right.
need for
Thank
heavy
you, Sharon.
industry, etc., for the future.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. Mafalda and Kathleen, and could you just briefly respond to that about where you're putting your money, Mafalda, from your investment funds, quickly, if you can?
And sorry, I've been missing part of the conversation because of my connection problems. As I said, everything we are going to be doing going forward. Already in the past, we were quite focused on, job creation, and we have the numbers that show points that have been made here today that investments in renewable energy are significant job creation investments. But going forward, we are placing this element of just transition, social inclusion, much more centrally in everything we will be doing. I gave the example of the co-transition program, which we just launched. People and communities and creation of jobs, social protection, reskilling, retraining will be a core element of what we'll be doing going forward.
So Kathleen and Kentaro, just briefly your reflection on what you've just heard from both Sharan and also Mafalda.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can speak to the geopolitical dimensions of various different heavy industries. What I can focus on is how we're thinking about that next decade, where we're looking at investing in renewables, doubling and then tripling renewables, looking at significant investment in battery storage. And then as we look to that next generation of technologies, we hit net zero, the role of hydrogen, advanced nuclear, and other technologies. So one of the things that's been really powerful to watch at Duke Energy is that our success is dependent on the success of our communities. If we don't have companies in our region that need power, if we don't have customers in our region that are paying for that power, and as they ask for increasingly clean energy, our business suffers. So it is really in our best interest to really invest in our communities to ensure that they are emerging really strongly from the COVID pandemic in terms of economic development, workforce, job creation, and all of these different things that are so critical to a healthy functioning society.
Kentaro, just to pick up on what Sharan said, can we call it optimism or realistically optimistic that actually significant change, innovative change is underway, technological change is underway, and that in its own way is going to be a significant part of transition and an equitable transition?
Yeah. I would be very simple is that there's no silver bullet or single, way to realize this transition, but there are various ways in globally where the region needs different kind of solutions. There are various ways to go, and from the technology side, I'm very optimistic about all of these technologies.
Very optimistic, even though we started the discussion talking about chasms and significant lack of understanding. Thank you all four of you for your time first thing this morning, to Kathleen, to Kentaro, to Sharan and Mafalda. Nice to see you all again. And thank you very much indeed for contributing with some positives there. Let's remember positives, even if there is concern about where we're going to end up at the end of this week. Thank you very much indeed, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.